sacrifice as relatedness.
अगर आपके छठे घर की दशा है ना, आपको लड़ना ही पड़ेगा। अब वो किस लेवल पे आप लड़ते हो? आप फिजिकली लड़ रहे हो जैसे जानवर लड़ते हैं?
That was an astrologer comparing humans to animals.
Ritual sacrifice, puja or bali, remains an important part of the propitiation of a number of local devi devta ghosts and unhappy spirits in Uttarakhand. Not all devi devtas ate sacrifice, but even vegetarian deities, quote unquote, such as Golu devta, could sometimes demand it for their guardian deities. Kushi pujas, like Neema's Atwar 8 goats, were offered in gratitude for acts of beneficence by devtas, whether the gift of children, jobs, or promotions. At the heart of these rituals is the belief that development could be successfully pursued only through the intervention of devtas, who reward piety and hard work and act as the ultimate trustees of terrestrial well-being.
Some of you may remember there were floods in 2023 in Himachal Pradesh, and a lot of people think that the deities were not happy, which is a reason for why the rains were so terrible in Himachal and caused 30 people at least to go missing. Devotees in turn must show their appreciation for these acts of divine favor. The regular performance of sacrificial rituals affirmed that devtas and bhakts existed in relation to one another, that devotion and care would be rewarded with economic, moral, and familial
prosperity. These pujas were usually offered both at large regional temples and humbler village shrines constructed out of stone and mud. Out-married daughters of a village, for instance, were expected to offer a sacrifice to some of the Isht, literally beloved or chosen deity, with whom devotees share an affective relationship. And Kul, family and lineage devtas of their natal village upon the birth of their first child.
So when they are married, there is one sacrifice to the Isht devta, and then one Kul devta offering when they give birth.
Of their natal village. If such sacrifices were not given voluntarily and quickly, Devi Devtas often became angry, bigarjana, and then had to be propitiated through a lengthy series of rituals intended to turn malevolence back into benevolence. Anthropological literature on sacrifice understands the practice as a set of ritual narratives and actions that variously establish forms of transaction with gods. And then she goes through a literary review. And then she says there's little or no attention paid to how its symbolization of victimhood might be tied to its distinctive materiality. So tying back to the whole I took care of these goats affect relationship. One reason for scholarly emphasis on semiotics at the expense of the who or what of the sacrificial body might be the reliance on sacrificial myths and texts that, especially in the Vedic context of South Asia, as Dr. Wendy Doniger notes, treat substitution not as a historical question, but as one relating to the nature of ritual symbolism, explaining how it is that plants or mantras stand for animals and animals for humans in the sacrifice. The symbolic systems of classification that underlay sacrificial substitution struck Levi Strauss, a famous French Jewish anthropologist, as wanting in good sense because they adopt a conception of the natural series which is false from the objective point of view, for it represents it as continuous. Levi Strauss's characterization of the nature of substitution and sacrifice has been critiqued by several scholars. For instance, Veenadas points out that the natural world is not, in fact, represented as continuous in Vedic sacrificial systems. Vedic texts include man among the 5 domestic animals who could be sacrificed. Oh my gosh. The questions that confront us are these. What properties allow an animal to symbolically substitute for humans in sacrifices where people were originally the prescribed victims? If we return to Neema's story about how animal sacrifice replaced the original practice of human sacrifice in the mountains, how do we make sense of the Devi's acceptance of an animal in place of a human? How can the sacrificial victim be understood as more than just
a symbol?
How do we recover its history as a fleshy being whose semiotic qualities are embodied and always entangled with material processes? In response to these questions, I offer the idea that systems of symbolic representation become meaningful when they are grounded in lived material relations, a theme that I will return to in the context of cow protection in Chapter 3. I am not going to read that. You guys will have to buy this book to learn more about cow protection, but let's go back to goats. To be more specific, the substitution of goat for human in sacrificial rituals in Uttarakhand makes good sense when we recognize that the production of sacrificial symbolism occurs in a world of interspecies reciprocity and relationality. Returning to Neema's account of why the Devi accepted animal sacrifice in place of human sacrifice, it was the promise, Neema said, to substitute a victim who would be raised with as much love and care as a child that caused the Devi to relent. Neema's grief at the death of her goats bore testament to the depth of her Mamta, an affective kinship that gave meaning to the substitution of goat for human in the sacrifice offered to the Devi. A coconut, at least in Uttarakhand, is not imbricated in everyday relationships of care and maintenance and indeed love. As such, it is not symbolically significant. Coconuts, like vegetables, remain stubbornly other, insignificant in comparison to human and non-human animals. Lucinda Ramberg's observation that one does not make offerings to gods that are not valuable is apposite here. I think she means relevant. Taking seriously the experience of Neema and others like her, I am therefore suggesting that the symbolic identification between human and animal that undergirds sacrificial substitution in Uttarakhand is made possible by a shared sense of kinship fostered largely through the embodied experience of being entangled in intimate relations of care and mutual subjection. I follow Dr. Sarah Ahmed in understanding this affective kinship as emergent in the messiness of the experiential and unfolding of bodies into worlds, the process of being touched by what comes near. The idea that sacrificial animals share a bond of kinship with those who sacrifice them is not new to anthropological scholarship on sacrifice. On early Semitic sacrifice, Robertson Smith argued that the original sacrificial animal was akin to a totemic animal believed to be holy by those who sacrificed it. Human worshippers would, through the communal consumption of sacrificial meat, not only emphasize their blood relationship to the animal and the god, but also reaffirm their blood bonds with one another. Freud, summarizing Smith's observations, write that in pre-pastoral societies, the sacrificial animal was treated like one of kin. The sacrificing community, its god, and the sacrificial animal were of the same blood and the members of a clan. Emil Durkheim captures something of the essence of this kinship when he notes that the Aboriginal Giwegal of New South Wales believe that each person has within him an affinity for the spirit of some bird, beast, or reptile. It is not that the individual is thought to be descended from that animal, but that a kinship is thought to exist between the spirit that animates the man and the spirit of the animal. When Neema and other Pahari villagers articulate the importance of kinship, reciprocity, and debt in their relationship with animals whom they sacrifice, they ground these claims in the everyday acts of labor they perform in caring for these animals. In this painstaking labor, as intense and prolonged as that entailed in rearing children, that is at the heart of the idea that because animals are like children, they can substitute for human children in sacrifice. Labor and love, the stuff of kinship. One summer day in 2011, I accompanied my friend Kusum and her herd of 10 goats down a narrow mud path lined on either side with stinging nettle and fruit trees. We were on our way to the grazing grounds. One little white goat with brown spots had climbed up a small apricot tree. Ripe fruit fell to the ground as she pulled hard at the leaves. Before Kusum could fling a stone at her, an elderly farmer appeared on the other side of the low stone wall that bordered the path and proceeded to scold Kusum for not controlling her animals. The week before this unexpected meeting, Kusum's goats had ravaged a wheat field belonging to the farmer, whose name was Narinder Bisht. Kusum's younger children, who had been with the goats that day, but had fallen asleep while watching them. The goats promptly wandered into nearby fields and set to work, where they were caught in act by Bisht. He tied them to a post and sat next to them, waiting to scold the children when they appeared to collect their goats. Unfortunately for him, he too made the mistake of falling asleep, whereupon the children, who had been watching him from a distance, quietly untied the goats and took them home, flushed with triumph at having escaped a scolding. Having caught Kusum now, Bisht let loose about her thieving children and poisonous goats. That evening, Kusum told her husband that what had happened. "It's these goats," she said at the end, "always the root of conflict. Dusht animals, wicked animals. Goats and children," her husband grumbled, casting an eye on their two girls, who were watching TV instead of doing their homework. "They're both so troublesome. What can you do?" Kusum's husband, other villagers often drew comparisons between raising children and raising goats. They emphasized similarities between the two, especially when talking about how exasperating goats are. They noted their willfulness and tendency to run away when no one was watching. "You have to scold both children and goats," a woman told me once. I struggled ineffectually to coax a goat away from a patch of green garlic that he was consuming with alarming speed. If you had children or goats, you would know about this. They don't understand anything without a beating. She threw a stone at the goat, and he moved off lazily as if to prove her point. And then she goes on about like gendered labor, like how women raise goats and children, similarly difficultly, pictures of women performing grueling labor in order to take care for their animals, naughty animals. And then there's a story. "I would tie my 3-year-old son to one of the legs of the cot with my sari to keep him out of mischief. Then I would go off with the animals during the day. His older brother and sister would feed him and take him to the bathroom. He would cry and cry until he started choking, but what could I do? The animals couldn't go out on their own. My husband was busy with his work. You can't just abandon animals, expect them to roam on their own. I took a vow, vachan, raised them like children, with more care than my own children, cutting oak, cutting grass, chasing around after them the whole day. Once I found myself standing in front of a leopard when I followed one of the goats into the jungle to bring her back home. All this I do for my animals. How can I not feel mamta for them?" Like maternal devotion. Muni's words reveal how much the kinship women feel for the animals they raise is rooted in feminized productive practices and care. Relational care, as so many feminist scholars have pointed out, is linked with routinized, arduous labor. It is through arduous everyday acts of labor for animals that women and a few older men who are sometimes handed the responsibility of caring for the family's animals come to experience feelings of love and kinship for the animals they raise. The very fact that the term often used to evoke this sense of kinship is mamta, or maternal love, speaks to the gender division of labor that is at the heart of this love. While this does not at all diminish the affective intensity of this connection and the shifting and contingent ways in which it is made real in the lives of humans and animals, it does illuminate the patriarchal context and conditions in which interspecies love comes to fruition. So more about human versus animal sacrifice. One interviewee says, "Nobody sacrifices children anymore. We sacrifice animals. But in some ways, it's not that different. When you live with animals and raise them, they are like your children. And when they shake to consent, you feel the sense of pride in knowing that your children will die willingly to repay the mamta they receive. That's a real sacrifice when you offer a goat you love almost as much as your child, and he repays your love by dying." For this young woman, sacrifice closed a circle of kinship that began with the experience of living alongside and laboring on animals. As Anna Tsing notes, domination, domestication, and love are deeply entangled. Like other women and some older men, this woman too spoke of her feeling mamta for the goats toward whose lives she had oriented her own. Her feeling of relatedness to the goat she had raised was grounded in acts of labor that required her to align herself in relation to other bodies, an alignment that I have argued was saturated with embodied forms of affect. This already powerful sense of relatedness was intensified by the death of the animal in sacrifice. For the young woman, the goat's sacrificial death cemented her belief that she and the animal were united by a kin relationship. As she understood the situation, the goat had repaid the maternal love with which she had raised him by dying on behalf of his human family. This was also a claim that Neema had made in response to Girish's accusation that she did not really care for the animals whom she had offered as sacrifice on the day of Navratri in 2011. Like the Bengali families that Lamb worked with, many villagers in Uttarakhand, especially women, understood sacrifice as a transactional relationship wherein a lifetime of care and nourishment creates a qarz, debt, that the sacrificial animal pays with his blood. But unlike forms of intergenerational nourishment in human family relationships that are fairly linear, in the sense that the responsibility of giving passes from parent to children, sacrifice entails more of a circular form of indebtedness. This difference is owing to the nature of repayment expected by the children. Human children must provide for their parents when they become old and ritually nourish their parents as ancestors after death, writes Lamb in her 2000 book, An Anthropologist. But they do not have to die to return the debt they owe their parents. In the case of sacrifice, however, the debt is repaid by animal children with blood. The spectacular nature of the offering now imposes a debt on humans in turn. They must acknowledge this final and unmatchable act of kinship with an offering of their own. What people offer in turn are ordinary, uninnocent, ethical acts that derive meaning and consequence from the fact that they emerge through remorseful, sometimes even haunted reflection on past and future instances of violence. These ethical practices are relational. Work on the self is already and always work on the self in relation to another. I think of the ethical as a dimension of everyday life.
Indeed, people's practices of mourning and atonement in Kumam did not emerge from any societal consensus on the immorality of sacrificial violence. More often, they were fleeting and unremarkable.
A quick caress of a goat's head before he was taken to the kill area. The flinch of a body when the sacrificial blade came down to sever the head from neck. Tears streaming down a face at the end. But through such ethical gestures, people reaffirmed their connection to the animals, whose deaths they mourned and extended relatedness into realms beyond this life.